Leader, our speaker today, Mike Landrum. He's been with the congregation a very long time. He's a very caring member of the congregation. He has served as our board president. He currently sits on a few committees as well. And he did some beautiful woodwork up here. And these exhibits wouldn't be possible without him. So Mike Landrum is going to talk about Ben Franklin. And those of you at home on Zoom, the presentation will be recorded.
Thank you, Bill. First of all, I want to tell you that this has been a complete pleasure for me to research the life and works of Benjamin Franklin. He was born in 1706 on January 6th, which then became January 17th, starting in, I think, 1752, they changed the calendar. And I related to him because his family was poor as dirt as well, like mine. Somehow or other, that similarity seems to vanish after a year or two, and I did not have the inventive mind or the... He was born a Rotarian, I think. He was a natural networker. And he started so many organizations that persist into the future and that created the Society of America. In fact, I think he created the idea of America. Are you hearing me okay online? I should check every now and then. I get kind of focused for a live audience, you know, it's what the actor in me. All right, a couple of things. Let me get my. No, it's not going to do it. Oh, there. I tell you, this Zoom and live business is a little like rubbing your stomach and patting your head at the same time. So I appreciate your bearing with me as I fumble around with all the tools of presentation here. All right, let's see. I had some stuff. I read two of the biographies I read. The first, the oldest, was by Carl Van Doren, a magnificent volume, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1938. Carl Van Doren was quite a famous scholar and teacher, professor at Columbia University. Born in my part of the world, in Urbana, Illinois, and he wrote a beautiful book. He wrote, one of the things he wrote about Ben Franklin, it's sort of the epilogue, the prologue, is he was and is unsurpassed by any man in the range of his natural gifts and the important uses he put them to. Now, I did some additional research, and Wikipedia tells me that in 1700, the population of the planet was about 650 million people. Great Britain was quite crowded, actually, about over 120 million. And the United States, or the Northern American continent, including all of the Indians and other native species, was about only 1 million people. So out of a population of 1 million, Ben Franklin had to have been the smartest kid in the hemisphere. And Van Doren is right. He began to work immediately. He said, I cannot remember not being able to read. What a statement. And there were books available to him, even though he was, as I said, from a family as poor as his father was a tallow chandler. That's somebody who turns animal fat into candles or soap. And it is at the bottom of the scale of work. You can't imagine a more stinky place to live. And he was living in a tiny house on Milk Street, right across from the Old South Church in Boston. That's where he was born. He was the 10th, or perhaps it's better to call him the 15th, because 5 of his siblings died. And his parents had 17 children. In fact, that's 2 mothers in that birthing marathon. A crowded little stinky house. And for the first apprenticeship, his first work, his father put him to work as an assistant for the tallow chandling business, which he hated. But there were a few books on the shelf. And one of the first books he ever read was The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Now, I don't know how many of you know that book or have looked into it recently, but it's an adventure story. It's told from first person. It tells about the growth, and it's a holy book because it's about going towards God by this pilgrim. But still, it's a fascinating book, and you can imagine young Franklin identifying with John Bunyan throughout that. Now let me put these cheaters on. I have here the other biography that I devoured. And this one is by Walter Isaacson, a man who is still among us. Those of you who watch, what's the name of the woman? Late Show? Kristen, yes. What? Amanpour, yes. Walter Isaacson is one of her regular spokesmen and interviewers, and a fascinating man. He's written many great books. In fact, I understand he got the, he told the story of Leonardo da Vinci, of Steve Jobs, and I understand he was recently picked to write the biography of the fella that's putting rockets up. Say again? Yes, him. I can't hear very well, and you don't speak very clearly, so I'll pass that. All right, let's get on to Ben Franklin. Most of you know about his early exciting adventures, becoming a printer, making his brother angry at him for being the smartest guy on his staff, why his brother wouldn't be happy to have a brother who could write the silence do-good essays, which were a huge hit and sold a lot of newspapers for him. But anyway, then he went on to New York, no work in New York, I can relate to that, and went on then to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, he began his own printing business, and there, of course, his bestseller was the Almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard, of course, is a little play on words. And the French translated Poor Richard as, and named a warship Bonhomme Richard, Bonhomme Richard. And that ship, it wasn't French, it was actually given to John Paul Jones, who fought a battle with it and sank it. So, All right, so until 1776, most of the colonial leaders believed, or politely pretended to believe, that America's dispute was with the king's ministers, with Parliament. And they considered themselves loyal subjects of the king, and they were proud of that, and that applies to Franklin as well. In fact, it was 1774 before he finally gave up his Britishness and became the American we know. So there was one piece of writing that changed the minds of many Americans, and that was a little pamphlet, 83 pages long, called Common Sense. A lot of people thought Franklin wrote it, but it wasn't Franklin who wrote it. It was written by by Thomas Paine. And the prose he used was very similar to Franklin's. Isaacson says, in the prose that drew its power, as Franklin's often did, from being unadorned, the author argued there is no natural or religious reason for the distinction between men who are kings and subjects. Hereditary rule was a historic abomination. Paine said, of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Yes. You know the colonials laughed at that because they were being treated as though by a ruffian. And, these redcoats running around and being cops. Well, he went on to say, everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. And within weeks of its appearance, that pamphlet sold 120,000 copies. Now, Franklin's had a more direct hand than you may realize, because Paine approached him on the streets of London and told him he was a believer in the American cause and wanted to emigrate to America. So Franklin bought him a ticket, wrote to his son-in-law and said, set this guy up in a job, give him a place to live. I like him. And that's what they did. When Paine showed him the manuscript for Common Sense, Franklin offered his wholehearted support, along with a few suggested revisions. Finally, the assemblies that governed the colonies became aware of Paine's writing, and they began to vote for independence, for revolution. He only got here in 1774. One important thing that you should know, too, is that Franklin's allegiance to the King of England was pretty strong, and he kept trying to persuade the king and the Parliament and those balkish ministers, and particularly the proprietors of the various colonies. He had ongoing wars with Penn and Pitt, who were the proprietors of Pennsylvania, and a fellow named Hutchison, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And they had huge arguments. And Franklin would offer suggestions saying, look, treat people as they need to be treated. And it would later appear in the Declaration of Independence, you have an obligation to your subjects to treat them well. And it was the plain view of that that began to change people's minds. So the assembly in Virginia was run by the Henry Lee and his brothers, ancestors of Robert E. Interesting how this country has its goods and bads, you know. You turn a die over and the 6 has a 1 on the other side. All right, so anyway, that assembly of Virginia finally wrote, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." And that was the beginning of the revolution. That was 1774. So, of course, the next thing to do is for the Congress, which had been meeting all this time, these various colonists from various colonies showing up every so often, and there was the Second Continental Congress had now met, and Franklin and you know who, Alexander Hamilton, the founders, Jefferson and Franklin, began to have conversations about the declaration that they needed to have. We need to declare, and in fact, it says so in the Declaration. It's our job now to give you reasons why we are going to take this drastic step. So at first there was a little argument with John Adams. John Adams, as those of you, how many of you have read that wonderful biography of John Adams by the fella that shows up on TV a lot? It's an excellent biography as well. But Adams was, not exactly a friendly, easygoing guy. So when Jefferson said, I'm getting a lot of guff from Adams that he wants to write this declaration, but Adams responded by saying, "Reason first, you're a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am an obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular," so at least Adams had some self-awareness. "You are very much otherwise," speaking to Jefferson. "Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." And so the job went to Jefferson. Jefferson finished a early draft and went over to Franklin and said, send him a note. "Will Dr. Franklin be so good as to peruse it," he wrote in his cover note, "and suggest such alterations as his more enlarged view of the subject will dictate." And this document still exists in the Library of Congress, of course, and on its website. And I can show you a picture of it here because I've got a lot of photographs to show, so I better hurry up. Okay, Franklin made actually only one change. He changed the last 3 words of Jefferson's sentence that began, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin changed those words to self-evident. What does that mean? It takes it out of the realm of religion. It means it is not up to God, but it is a plain fact in exactly the same way that 3 angles make a triangle. By using the word sacred, Jefferson had asserted, intentionally or not, that the principle in question, the equality of men and their endowment by their Creator with inalienable rights, was an assertion of religion. Franklin's edit turned it instead into an assertion of rationality. And that is an important thing to understand about Franklin, because one of the other things I put on the title of this talk was I called Benjamin Franklin the first American Unitarian. He sounds like someone we would meet in this congregation. He had that kind of that kind of mind, your kind of mind, our kind of mind. All right. See, now I get it. All right. Franklin would probably have agreed with his contemporary writer, Henry Fielding, who wrote in his novel, Tom Jones, the word religion is as vague and uncertain as any in the English language. Franklin was raised with Calvinist and Puritan teachings as a boy, and then he read Locke and toyed with deism until he declared that this doctrine is possibly true but not very useful. So he began to embrace a fortified brand of deism that held that God was best served by doing good and helping other people. That sounds like one of our principles. And because he believed that the churches were useful to the community, he paid his annual subscription to support the town's Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Jedediah Andrews. And one day Andrews appealed to him to sample my Sunday services, which Franklin did for 7 weeks. And he found them uninteresting and unedifying, focused on doctrine and dogma, and geared toward making people good Presbyterians rather than good citizens. And finally, Franklin adopted a creed that would last him the rest of his life, a morally fortified and pragmatic version of deism. But like the other deists, his faith was devoid of sectarian dogma, burning spirituality, deep soul searching, or a personal relationship with Christ. As Diderot once quipped, a deist is someone who has not lived long enough to become an atheist. Yes. How many have called us atheists? We have atheists. Do you remember the talk that Lance Pahaki gave years ago? Embracing atheism. Now I got to admit, it's attractive, atheism. Feels like when the cat's away, the mice can play. There's a certain, no one's watching. That kind of freedom to atheism. Huh? You got to admit, it sounds all right. So Franklin lived a very long and, despite the suspicions of John Adams and others that he was a closet atheist, he repeatedly and indeed increasingly asserted his belief in a supreme God. Okay, how are we doing for time? Oh, it's late. All right. Yes. Wait. Here, come closer.
I'm not big on speaking in public. I'm a retired scientist and business guy, and Franklin is very famous for this experiment with the key and the kite. So basically the experiment was to ascertain or confirm that lightning was the same as electricity, which he did. Unfortunately, a number of people reproduced this experiment, in France in particular, and most of them got killed.
That's true. That's true. When he sent a kite up into the clouds, yes, and he sent the kite into an area of charged electrons, which affected the string of the kite until it stood out as one's hair would stand out if you got too close to an open wire. Are you telling me it's time to quit? Oh, okay. I'll go with your say-so. Do you want to see some pictures? Yes? Okay. Let me find out where. Sorry, I guess I'm rubbing when I ought to be patting here. Here we go. No, wait. Here they are. Is this going to show up?
It'll show on the screen, Mike. Got to screen share first.
I'm not screen sharing. See there? See there? I need Franklin. Now, what would Franklin do in a case like this? Oh, damn. I'm sorry. This is the saddest part of. Here, share. There, now you seeing that? All right. Wait a minute. All right, so many portraits of Franklin. You know, the French loved him more than anyone. He lived in France from the 1776. The Continental Congress immediately recognized his value as a diplomat. He can raise some money for us because we were poor as church mice. The revolution needed arms, needed an ally, needed ships, and had none. The French, though, why, they've been fighting the English for 400 years. Let's get them on our side. So it didn't take a genius to figure out who would be the best ally. Franklin was there like a shot. And they loved him. Why? Because he wrote the first, he drew the first political cartoon. And that little cartoon is still being used today by, certain people who vote for certain people, but we won't go into that. All right, sorry to bring it up. At one point, Franklin was so insistent that the British had to change the way they were treating Americans, that they put him on trial. They humiliated him. Did you know, for instance, that Henry VIII had a cockpit? They had cockfights in the palace. Yes. This is at the same time Henry VIII is supposedly the head of the Church of England. But let's have a little cockfight tonight. All right. So that was the room that you see here, and there stands Franklin suffering the humiliation and accusations of all the Brits, all the aristocrats who realize that they're the ones who are going to have to pay the price if this independence idea gets started. God help us if it's turns up over here in this country. All right. Oops. Excuse me. This is Mrs. Franklin. Well, not really. They lived together. It was a common law relationship, not unlike mine with my dear love, Etty. Yes. All right. So this was Deborah Reed. And he was off in England for 20 years and didn't even bother coming back when she got sick and died. Strange man. This is his son, his illegitimate son. Now, I'm not saying Ben Franklin was, but at least he didn't have cockfights in his house. Anyway, this man was William Franklin, who became, a little bit through the influence of his father, became the governor of New Jersey, the colony of New Jersey. He was a rock-rib Republican. He was a rock-rib royalist is what he was. And they had knock-down, drag-out arguments about that and never did make up to each other. This is his daughter. She married a fellow named Richard Bache, or Bach, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Had a couple of children. So Franklin had grandchildren running around, which he loved. This is Franklin himself, the first painting made of him when he was about 40. Looks like a wealthy young man, but he was proudly wearing a leather apron most days. I don't know where that came from. Whoops. Now it won't go on. What have I done wrong here? Let me use this. Oh, somebody's drawn on my screen. Evidently I have. This is Franklin, another painting. This is him in France. I don't have dates or... in France, he was beloved for wearing a fur cap. He was kind of like Davy Crockett. The French, of course, were the most glorious dressers, and their wigs piled up, you know, and they had all of these presumptuous ways of, you know, doing. Franklin wasn't going to have any of that. He says, look, I'm me. You got to take it or leave it. 2 minutes, I'll be done. Okay, here we go. There is the declaration, the first draft. And where is the, anyway, down here. Go on Zoom, go on the internet and you can see it. This is where he lived in London on Craven Street. This is the Continental Congress in now talking about setting up the Constitution. By the way, that Constitution delivery that I made a few months ago was from another book by Carl Van Doren called The Great Rehearsal, which is a thorough history of the Continental Congress's deliberations to create the Constitution. And there's Franklin down in the foreground dozing. And this is one of the glory pictures of him flying the kite. And there is a very good French sculpture of him. Okay, stop the share. That's enough of that. And sorry, Bill, that I went overtime. That's my talk. Thanks for listening.